Thank you very much for inviting me. I've come to Vienna often, but in very different, into research institutes, so it's great to be in public and to talk to you about, every author loves to talk about his or her books, and I'm no exception. I'll tell you a little about where this book fits into my larger work, and then something that's new in it. I've written all my life about two things, about work and place, about labor and cities. And about 15 years ago, I began thinking that what I hadn't done enough of was kind of theorize labor, what it means to work. And I decided to write this series of books on homo faber, on man or woman, as maker. And the first of these books was a book on craftsmanship, on making things. And the second was the kind of social condition of making the workshop, the necessity of people to cooperate in order to make things. And this book is about making environments. So this is very much a book orientated to makers and to the production of urban environments. And that's where it fits in this trilogy of books. The new thing that I've added here was practical work, which I have been involved in all my life. I've been a consultant to the UN. I have sat in more meetings than any other living human being, I think, in a university. I mean, I just... there are a lot of meetings in the UN. But I've done various practical things for the UN. I chaired UNESCO's Urban Studies Committee, World Heritage Sites. I've done work with the World Bank and UN Development Body. And most recently, Saskia Sassen and Richard Burdett organized something called Habitat 3, which is an enormous conference that the UN has every 20 years on the state of the environment. And you can read, there's a huge, if you're interested in what people around the world, not just us, are thinking about cities, you can find this online at something called www.quitopapers with /UN, because we started this project in Quito and it's finished. So that's what's new in this book. I have tried to bring in some of this work, the projects that I've been involved in talking about making an environment. And for this evening, what that means is, look, I know nothing about Vienna really urbanistically. I do know where to get good coffee, but that's something else. Here, of course, the best coffee here. But I'm going to show you some work we've been doing abroad in developing countries, and we're going to have a discussion about if there's any resonance in Vienna. I should tell you why this book it was originally called in English, The Open City. And we, could somebody help her find a chair? Wouldn't that be possible? Yeah, good. There's a novel called Open City by someone named Teju Cole, so we had to find another title. But my idea about opening up cities is really, it's based on something rather technical, but is in a way simple and intuitive to understand. And it is that an open city is a place where things that allows the city to become more complex. And the open city is based on open systems theory. I teach at MIT and from time to time, and I teach there now. And I was very influenced by the open systems thinking, particularly in the media lab of MIT, which is, as you'll read in my book, which is looking at how do we make systems that are complicated, open, where new things happen, systems which are non-linear in their evolution, which can evolve in flexible rather than rigid ways. Above all, how to create synergies between different parts of a system so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I just thought, well, that must apply to cities. Again, this is not a particularly original thought. Are you all right?
The microphone like this because it makes like better.
I can do, yes, like that. Okay, okay. Who knew? Aristotle's idea of a city was that people who are the same can't make a city. It doesn't make markets. It doesn't create any kind of innovation. It doesn't create any kind of social bond between people. A city is a place where differences come together and they interact. A city is a place of where strangers meet rather than an intimate small place. That's for Aristotle and oikos. It's a little village. And my thought about this was that what's happening today, particularly in what's happening today is that cities are closing in, and that potential for making a complex environment, an environment which has many layers, is being reduced. And in my book, I try to explain the role of neoliberal capitalism in creating a more simplified, brutal, isolated environment where people are pulled apart from each other, where they don't interact. As an effect of modern capitalism, that the city is closing. One sign that you have of that kind of closure in a large scale is, of course, your obsessions with foreigners, these horrible influences from abroad. This terrible thing, you might hear Arabic on the street, so dreadful. So destructive of the Austrian way of life, all of that. So, those are signs of closure in a society. And we find them, of course, in developing cities as well. This kind of far-right stuff. And the problematic for me was, is there anything we can do about making a city, about the physical design of it, which might countervail against this kind of closure, which is the moment we are. So the first thing so that's basically the idea of this book. It's the last book I'll write about cities, so it's take it or leave it. But I want to show you what some of this means in terms of the physical, the built environment, what open and closed means. This, I never use PCs, so I hope this all works. I want to show you first, can you see it? Okay. This is an example of an open city in Delhi. What you're looking at here is a parking garage. You're looking at the roof of an underground parking garage, and on the side at a set of offices. Originally, the parking garage roof was not meant as a public space, and the offices were sort of for fat cat politicians in Delhi. The politicians moved to different quarters, and what came in on in their place were lots of tech startups, lots of new small businesses oriented tech. And on the ground plane here, the roof of this garage, is Delhi's market for stolen goods in technology. For instance, you can buy this iPhone for 1/10 of its price in New York, and there are ways to unlock it, and so I'm not going to go into that. It's an amazing space because it's a space that's has enabled people, very poor people, to get a toehold in the city. It's an open space because it's informal. And the first question I'm going to ask you is, this is a space in which people became enabled, poor people became enabled in the city by the city letting this area develop on its own without trying to regulate it, which is an essential aspect of informality. Is that something that's meaningful to you? We are trying to protect this space now, which is, like many dynamic informal spaces, is subject to a kind of vulture condition where money from abroad, Chinese money, is trying to buy this space and put up an office building here instead. And one of our tasks has been to figure out ways to protect what is a very meaningful space in the tech economy of India. So that's an issue of informality as a positive. I just show you, this is the contrast to this. I'll show you two contrasts to this. It is an example of a closed system which has no informality in it. That is, there's no way, it's very difficult to get off of this transport system into the land or underneath it or around it. It's closed in a literal sense. And Shanghai, as it's developed, has found that this, which looked like modernity and the whole process of being able to develop, is now very, very counterproductive. This is a Beijing workers' housing, which is another example of closure that is closer to the contrast to Delhi. This is a space which is meant to defeat informality. It's a space that was, that was created, which has no public space at all. People in it are beginning to suffer all the psychological problems of isolation in terms of elderly people and kids, of living in a place where there is nothing that is not controlled. Here's another example of, another example of what happened in China to convert a relatively open situation for poor people, in this case, into a closed situation, in this case, to gentrify the space. So that's basically give you the kind of dynamics of what we're dealing with. That the normal way of developing rapidly developing cities is to build closed environments like this, and that the, have I got there? No, this is it. Are you seeing Nehru Place? And that these kinds of open spaces, which are more economically and socially enabling, are under threat. I should say that one of the urgent reasons for this informality in Delhi is, as you know, that India is consumed by violent relations between Hindus and Muslims. This is the most peaceable space in Delhi. It's never had a racial riot, unlike most of the rest of the city. Because people are, not that people are nice to each other, they're all competitors, selling illegal phones or motherboards that dropped off the back of a truck, or 1,000 USBs. They're all competing, but they're physically in the same space, and they have to live together in that space in order to do their own business. They have to live with others to do their own business. So it is for us a model of a lesson of informality that's important. The second thing I should go on, just go faster. I'm sorry. If only you had Max. I want to just show you one Western source for a lot of this kind of closure. This is Corbusier's Plan Voisin for Paris of 1924, 1925. It has as a structural feature a feature of closure which is additivity. There's no interaction between these towers. The system is just the sum of its parts. Understand what that is? And Corbusier thought you could extend these towers all over Paris. They could cover all of Paris. It didn't matter because they're non-interactive. They're additive instead. There is no synoikosmos. I'll show you something else which is quite interesting. At the other end of the system of closure is some smart city designing which has proved a disaster in terms of closure. And that is a rigid fit between form and function. Here you're looking at a docking station for automated cars designed for the smart city of Masdar. Unfortunately, this car, designed by Norman Foster, has a light lithium battery and is much smaller than cars that were designed before. And if you go back to this, you'll see that this car it wouldn't be functional in this docking station. You'd walk out of the car and there's an 18 centimeter gap. You're likely to fall in. The principle here that's important about this kind of disaster is that when you have a rigid fit between form and function, something that's fit for purpose, you create technological obsolescence. Do you understand what I mean? That something that works perfectly, does exactly what it's supposed to do, is probably going to be thrown out in 5 years' time. And that's the other principle of closure. That closure occurs when a thing can only do one thing, or when it's fit for purpose. So in the built environment, we want to figure out ways to defeat that. For us, that is also a question of the informal is related to the porous. And when we look at places like this image of Caracas, or we're working there, which you see in this image of Caracas, is a rigid boundary between essentially the poor and the middle class, made by traffic. This is different than the Shanghai thing. This is the use of motion as a way to segregate people in space. So the second thing we're interested in doing is taking down, making different parts of the city more porous. In addition to informality, we want to pursue a kind of porosity between different parts of the city at its edges. For us, that has a very practical implication, that we're trying, as in this case, we've located a school and a health clinic at the edge of this highway, and we've created all sorts of ingresses so you can get across from one way or another to both the school and the health service, just so that poor people and middle-class people are physically in the same space. And to do that, we're focusing on edge conditions rather than on centers. The practical planning application of this is not to put in the middle of places all the services it needs. If you have a Muslim refugee community, you should not put in the middle of it its school. You should put it on the edge where it bleeds into some other kind of community. So porosity is a big issue for us. And finally, and we're doing a lot of studies of more porous forms of housing. I'm not going to explain those to you because you'll never go home tonight. But I do want to say something about work. These machines are so slow. You need to get into Max. I won't tell you about this. This is work I've done. You don't want to see this. But you do want to see what's coming up here. This is Jane Jacobs and me, you mentioned Jane Jacobs, at the White Horse Tavern in New York. I knew her very well, particularly when she fled America to go to Toronto with her, Canada with her family. The interesting thing about this photo to me is the man in between us. He's drunk and he's slumped over on the counter of the White Horse Tavern, which is in the West Village. And I, as a rather jejune young man, said, gosh, maybe we should call the police or, or get him to a hospital or something like that. He's slumped out. And she, with a martini in her hand, by the way, said, let him be. He's got a right to be here as much as you do, If he's unhappy, so what? That's his problem. It's a kind of cosmopolitan knowledge, which is that a city is a place where people are released from propriety, from sympathy, from the kinds of concerns that you would have for some people you knew. I mean, if this were my father, of course I'd get him to a hospital as fast as possible. It may seem very cruel for this, but for her this was a basic principle of urban life, that a city, what's the German phrase? Stadtluft macht frei? Is something? Yeah, is that it? My German's so terrible. That means that people are, free to diverge. This is a picture of, we never see something like this as a picture of diversity and toleration, but that's exactly what it was. So it's in my mind, I'm sorry to get lost in this, but it is another aspect of why people should live in cities, to be released from community. That's a very important thing, to be released from having to be one kind of person. We never think about ourselves psychologically as one-dimensional. We have lots of aspects of ourselves that don't fit together. And the same thing should be true socially, you know? So anyhow, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to share the last thing about this for the UN about openness is the relationship between adaptation and mitigation and climate change. And I just show you a couple of projects, both of them quite beautiful, but which have a different attitude between open and closed articulations of the relation between cities and climate change. This is a proposal by Bjarke Ingels to put what he calls a necklace around southern Manhattan in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. You know, this terrible storm that hit the U.S. And it's essentially a way to build yourself out of climate change. That is to shut out the water, to create a boundary over which the climate can't cross. It's a closed reaction to climate change in terms of urban form. Whereas my group, do you know what a berm is? A berm is a huge pileup of sand and rock. It's like a natural wall. Whereas my group at MIT is looking at a way of adapting to storms, to work with them, not to prevent their impact, but for the city to recover from these attacks of extreme weather. And it's not an either-or decision, but it's a question of whether this is a much more open system. It's erratic, it's nonlinear, it's adapted to the fact that we can't predict extremes of climate change exactly when they're going to happen. So this for us, in terms of what is going to be the biggest challenge to cities in the future, far more important than whether somebody is speaking Arabic on your street, it's a different way of thinking about working with difficulties rather than trying to prevent them. And this is a problematic that started with the IPCC meetings in 2015, the Paris meetings, and that Habitat 3 has tried to intersect with. That we need, the practical reason we need to think open rather than closed is that we're dealing with an erratic system that is unfolding in terms of changing the physical structure of cities. So these are three preoccupations that I've had in working in the developing world with my teams and about open and closed. The issue of informality, the issue of porosity, and the issue of working with resistance rather than trying to work against it. In the most physical challenge we face in cities, how to be more adaptive to then think we could build ourselves out of this. Can I just say as a last thing about this, then I'll shut up. I feel about this whole issue that of open and closed is it's not so much a politics about what politicians, sorry, I'd never think of you as a politician, about what politicians debate about, who wins the debate about this. These are issues of open and closed that are physical, that are nonverbal, that are something that are in our bodies, you know? And the urbanism that I've try to explore in my writings from Flesh and Stone, I don't know if you know that book, Flesh and Stone, onward, is really about the sensory, non-articulable relations between people in cities. The idea that the more you can explain yourself, the better you are in politics, is to me very blinkered. Most people are pretty inarticulate. A city is not a place of discourse in any kind of way that we would think about a conversation. It's a place of strangers. It's a place of silences. The body speaks. And that's what to me, this kind of open urbanism is about. And so I'd be very interested to know whether this resonates with Vienna, and that you have to tell me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, it is what you just said, especially at the end, is so deeply provocative in the best sense. It's amazing. But are you okay not being a politician?
I don't know if I am.
Let me answer for you. You are not a politician.
But it's an interesting discussion actually, because politics matters in interesting ways, and it's like for us as a cultural institution, it matters that the formal power of the city actually expresses its solidarity and support for what we do. So it's such an interesting quagmire, because in some ways it's a compliment, but of course it's a compliment that you as a member. In any case, Christoph, does it resonate with Vienna?
First of all, thank you very much, Richard, for your talk and for your ideas you developed in your book and books, so to say. And yeah, of course, there's a strong resonance, and but I would say an ambivalent one. Because, for example, to let me react in a spontaneous way, if you speak about narrow place and those spaces of informality, finally, an open city, which is also defined as a city which allows an open space for informality, should be or would be a city that is not afraid, that is not very much afraid about what people are doing and thinking. So it would be a city of trust, isn't it? So, for example, from a Viennese perspective, from an angle where the city, production of city and city building is so strongly related to top-down traditions, that means Otto Wagner, we had a wonderful exhibition here. Municipal socialism, Red Vienna, post-war corporatist regimes, very, very strong top-down tradition of planning, where finally the planners, very, very competent in planning, in doing planning, don't really trust what people are doing and thinking. And so I would say an open city is a city where there is also a kind of place for creating trust, isn't it? In the sense of that you allow people to interact, to encounter, to develop ideas, to develop projects, and not, so to say, regulate even before you know what's really going on.
Right. Well, it's a very provocative idea. I think we're not quite on the same page, because what would interest me is, here in Vienna, any Western city, the developed cities have a lot of abandoned, disused spaces in them. I don't know if it's true in Vienna, but in London, for instance, the collapse of manufacturing has left a huge landscape of abandoned warehouses and manufacturing things, which is a little parallel to what happened to Nehru Place. It was abandoned by these bourgeois Indians who wanted something grander, and this was space that was colonized by people. It didn't require trust. Indifference was rather the operative principle. And as a positive thing, when I worked in, I'm going to show you something. I don't know how to make this thing work, but let's go back. I'll show you, God, these machines. No, they're so primitive, these Microsoft machines. I'll show you something like this. When I worked in the Planning Commission in New York, here is a space which is the underside of a highway. And in one side of it, below it, is Columbia University, and to the other side of it is Harlem. And we did something very simple. We filled it in. It was a space nobody thought about. We made a grocery store there that was used by both people at Columbia and Harlem. All over most cities is waste space like this, which are opportunities for informal development. I understand exactly what you mean about trust. Yeah. But this is the other it's the side that there's no money in this. Nobody has become rich from this grocery store. So it was possible it was quite a technical feat to put it underneath this highway. So I'm thinking of something else in developed cities, which is you must have this as well. Vast stretches of things that are not attractive, that are not shiki-miki, is that the word? Do you know what I mean? That aren't fashionable, that have been abandoned. And those would seem to me to be the sites for bringing this kind of thing back.
But if I can follow up on exactly this question, to think about it pragmatically, I think we can all think in Vienna of spaces that we would like to see this kind of treatment. But there seems to be such an interesting ambivalence in your position, because on the one hand, you see a place for design and for power, for formal power to make interventions. On the other hand, you're deeply skeptical of power working in the urban landscape, and you're looking for ways in which a kind of quasi-anarchic, authentic practice or appropriation of these spaces also takes place. I mean, obviously this is dialectical, but would you give one of them primacy? I mean, if our city government identifies these spaces in Vienna.
You can't keep pointing at her. It's one of us.
See, it's interesting. It's such a small sentence that you're saying, and the implications are so huge, because it's precisely what Christoph was getting at. Like the things that tend to be good in your value system, I mean, the things about Vienna that good liberal lefties like all of us, cosmopolitan intellectuals like, are deeply, deeply the product of top-down, in this case, specific case, social democratic planning. And at the same time, there's tremendous ambivalence about that kind of planning for all the reasons that you state as well. But given the political situation we face, it's such an interesting strategic question on whether we, sort of as critical intellectuals, should, and this is so apropos, should work within or outside those power structures. And so I guess I'm asking your advice. But it seems implicitly you're saying we should be skeptical of the state of the municipality and of power in making these kinds of interventions.
Yes. Yes, we should be skeptical. But could I answer your question in another way? That a total system like Wagner's system, or La Seda in Barcelona, is a system which integrates infrastructure and below the ground and above the ground. And certainly in the kind of work that I was doing, when cities develop very rapidly, you can't, the infrastructure has to be planned totally. I mean, we had this in trying to get, I remember this so well, in the 90s, in getting fresh water to new parts of Mexico City. You can't do that locally. And the same thing with traffic to a lesser degree. But there's a problematic here, which is as you move above the ground, the question is what aspects of what's built on that infrastructure are subject to negotiation, to discussion with the people who are on the ground there, and so on. I know this isn't the sense of what you're asking me, but to me, in my practical work, the question has been what's that ambiguous zone as you move above the ground of what can be opened up to democratic debate and discussion. It's not immediately, not everything, obviously. And there are real technical issues in making the ground, this is a big issue at MIT, making the ground, the infrastructure, for instance, fiber cable infrastructure, lay it and organize it in such a way that people can use it differently above the ground. That's, but basically this is a question between what's hidden and what's evident. I guess on the political side, my first book was called The Uses of Disorder. I am by temperament an anarchist. I believe in it. I believe it's a way of the disrupting of total systems is a political good. And I've never been able to get rid of that way of, that's a political disposition I have. It's the planning that I like is planning that allows for a kind of measure of disorder and conflict in the experience of urban projects, spaces, and so on. So I mean, there are, a master plan can be very beautiful, but to me it's always something that is slightly a vice. Something that's you shouldn't be seduced by.
In your book, you have this wonderful distinction between cooperative planning and co-production of knowledge and co-production of planning. So the city is not something where experts and technocrats are working maybe in processes in the paradigm of participation, but it is really a co-production. But in the realities of our planning in our cities, in European cities, we have a technostructure finally. We have housing landlords, we have investors, we have big machines developing and producing the system. So my question really would be, even in the examples you gave us, where you think that these kind of co-production in a really concrete understanding could develop, against these strong, powerful...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this is a very illuminating point, because you can't do what I want until you break apart. You're talking about monopoly power. And what I envision in this book is, were you to break it apart, what would you do then? This is not a recipe for how to break down monopolies. And I think, something, it's a kind of egotism that architects have. If we had, or planners too, or even worse, if we could only show the right plan of what the city should look like, then Microsoft would wilt. You know, its share price would collapse because the right way was shown by the planner. You know, that's obviously garbage. The whole point about this is that by political means, if we can take apart or restrain monopoly capitalism, as happened a century ago, what would we then do? And that's the point at which I want to enter the discussion. What instead? You know, then what happens? You know, I agree with you totally. I mean, the reality now is that we're in the grip of economic as well as political monopolies. And that grip can be shattered. I mean, for instance, if these 5 big tech firms were held to account to pay their taxes, you know, because it's essentially a kind of vulture system where they install themselves in cities. The politicians are, you know, they're so enamored of big tech that they give them all this leeway. Were that to change, the tech would be less strong, and we could think about using other kinds of tech to make smart cities. Most of the, if I may say about that, most of the smart city technologies that we have now are produced by big firms, which tend to buy up and put out of business alternative smart systems of technologies. But those technologies are wonderful for creating tissue in a city. A place like Curitiba in Brazil has used Linux-based technologies to have community-based budgeting where the community is 100,000 people and it's interactive. We can do it.
Yeah, I liked very much the picture of Jane Jacobs and you in the pub, and what you told about the drunken person and her reaction. In my understanding, it is a kind of a subversive hospitality. And my question would be, isn't the dimension of hospitality, or what do you think, isn't the dimension of hospitality a core dimension of the open city, in that sense as you developed it?
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to echo that. That photo is extraordinary. I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, of course, it begs the question of who took it. I mean, who thought that is... but that's a different issue. Although I was thinking about the Praterstern quite intently when I saw that. Please do. I mean, this vision of the city as a space of liberation and the freedom to be drunk out of your mind and pass out, and Jane Jacobs having her martini next to you. It's remarkable. Christoph, hast du eine letzte Frage?
Yeah, again, maybe it's linked to hospitality, but it's something between hospitality, openness, and what we discussed before, the political dimension. It is the Eschamin, he spoke about the good city, and if I remember right, he says a good city is repair and relatedness, solidarity, re-enchantment, and rights. So the inhabitants of a city are not only inhabitants, they are right holders, they are citizens. So if we look on, for example, Vienna, it's a very interesting case. We have, in 10 years, if I remember right, 1.5 million people coming in and going out. So there's a huge flow, demographic flow. And this flow is much more important from the perspective of an open city as we look on stocks. But if you look on flows, people coming in, people are going out, the question of citizenship is a key issue. particularly in what you are speaking about, informality, participation, bringing in your ideas, developing a city, producing a city. So,
well, this is a really key issue for me and for us in dealing with a city like Caracas or in Brazil, Rio or Sao Paulo. And the issue is this, that most of these cities are swelling with people who have no formal right to be there. They seize abandoned land, they make housing, often over 2 or 3 generations, and at a certain point, when these barrios become sort of attractive to capital, they lose it because they have no rights. So a big issue, I'm not involved personally in this, but a big issue is how to give people tenure who have no legal rights. This was long ago envisioned theoretically by Henri Lefebvre, of course, in The Right to the City, that presence in a place is what gives you rights in that place. Today, it's here, again, just thinking about the situation maybe in Vienna, I don't know. If you took the kinds of issues that we're struggling with in giving poor people, not me, but we are struggling giving poor people citizenship rights even though they have no property rights, wouldn't that be the same thing here for migrants? Shouldn't a migrant who's illegal here have certain rights to the city because they're present? Right? Shouldn't they be able to vote? They live here. If they work here, they're contributing, to the pensions here and so on. This is an issue that has been absolutely kind of erased, as though you have to have papers in order to have rights. It's been erased by the kind of authorities. And it seems to us, as I say, looking at this from the perspective of the developing world, this is a form of enslavement, the notion of legal entitlement. So it's a very different notion of citizenship. It's the notion that if you're present, you are a citizen.
It's a huge issue in Vienna. Huge.
Yeah.
This concludes the formal part of the evening. Not that we were so formal. Ich lade Sie ein, den Abend weiter mit uns zu verbringen. Der Richard ist hier, kann mit Leuten sprechen, kann Bücher signieren, kann Fotos machen. Christoph, bleibst du auch da? Ich habe dich gar nicht gefragt, Christoph Reinbrecht, Professor für Soziologie an der Uni Wien, wissen aber alle. Richard Sennett habe ich nicht formal vorgestellt, weil Sie sind alle hier wegen ihm, Sie wissen, wer er ist. Ich erinnere nochmal an das großartige Café da hinten. Vielen, vielen Dank fürs Kommen. Kommen Sie bald wieder ins Wien-Museum, solange es noch so ausschaut wie jetzt. Am 3. Februar sperren wir nämlich und dann bauen wir ein bisschen um und dann wird es noch viel, viel cooler. Vielen, vielen Dank fürs Kommen. Bis bald.